Welcome to our second webinar on the crisis in the Ukraine with our own expert from the Hebrew University. Before Professor Press-Barnathan and Dr. Laron begin, I would like to invite you to join Hebrew University's initiative to help researchers and students from Ukraine by providing a safe academic haven. Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, is a moral imperative for each of us and a value that is integral to the mission of the Hebrew University. We are profoundly dismayed by Russia's brutal military invasion of Ukraine. Our hearts are with all who have been harmed, have lost family and friends, and remain at risk. In a show of solidarity with the Ukrainian people, Hebrew University is offering temporary academic posts to Ukrainian academics, as well as the opportunity for Ukrainian graduate students to continue their research and studies at Hebrew University, offering monthly stipends as well as free room and board at on-campus residences. How you can help? Hebrew University has set aside a modest amount towards helping those from the Ukraine. Your support will enable even more students and scholars to be able to take advantage of these opportunities. We will put more information about the chat. And now, I would like to introduce to you Professor Galia Press-Barnathan, the director of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations at the Hebrew University, and a professor in the Department of International Relations, and Dr. Laron, a senior lecturer in the Department of International Relations and the author of the sixth. We look forward to learning about and better understanding the current crisis. And Galia and Guy, please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I will start this. I am, as I said, the engaged interviewer. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm glad to see a lot of people are joining us. Let me just give a few words of context, I guess, before we zoom into our main topic here. We're almost a month into this really horrible war. Clearly, this is a dramatic, historical event. The Russian invasion and breach of sovereignty of, a large state in Europe is, the first large-scale war in Europe since 45. And there's so much we can say about this war, the causes of the war and its consequences, but we will not do this here tonight, maybe on another webinar. But I would just say that I think that the war has generated major strategic and normative challenges to the Western democratic camp. The initial point for me is that the risk of military escalation, which we're still sort of looking at very carefully, has generated these basic dilemmas that are embodied in the principled American decision not to use military force to help Ukraine, despite the large-scale human suffering that is taking place there, and and all of that. So I think that's the starting point of the various dilemmas that face the Americans, that face the European states as well, that are more closely involved in this conflict. But the conflict has also generated dilemmas for other states that stem largely from the complexity of, maneuvering between the United States and the so-called Western camp, and Russia on the other hand, and perhaps, we can add China there. I'm not sure. That's a topic, again, for another discussion. So Turkey is caught in this complex situation. Even Japan and Asia is caught in this complex situation, given the amount of diplomatic and economic efforts they've made to improve relations with Russia until now. I'm saying all this just to put the Israeli case in a broader international context. Clearly, we have our own issues, but we are not alone with these dilemmas. So there is a broader context here. However, the goal of our conversation today is to zoom in to look at where Israel stands in face of this war. And as you can see from the title of this webinar, we know that the war has intensified tension and friction between the US and Russia, and that has put Israel in a complex situation of maneuvering between these two, or as we said in the title, East and West. However, it's important to remember that this is not a new thing that, as we will soon hear, this need to maneuver between East and West is actually something that the State of Israel had to deal with from its creation. Consequently, the way we thought of, Guy and me thought of structuring this conversation is to actually begin by dedicating time to examine the history of this complex triad, Israel between the US and the Soviet Union turned into Russia later. So we want to talk about the historical context, which, Guy is the best expert we could talk to about this. And then we will turn to discuss the current situation, the various competing interests that Israel has in the current situation, and we will end with raising the dilemmas that come from a normative perspective in terms of how we manage these more strategic, rational dilemmas, and what role do normative factors have in this situation. So this is the plan. I hope you stick with us. We will, at the end, look at the questions that you are welcome to write in the chat. I will try to manage them, and Mara will help me here. And if there are many of them, I apologize in advance that we won't. We'll have to pick and choose, and I hope we can continue the conversation later on somewhere else on another platform. So without further ado, Guy, I turn to you. And I'm happy to hear about the historical context of all of this, because there's a lot of it going on and people are less familiar with the history of these relations.
Yeah, so Israel and the Zionist movement have a long history with Russia and later with the Soviet Union, trying to, squeeze 100 years into 3 or 4 minutes. Basically, Russia was the cradle of the Zionist movement, and it was a political movement that acted in parallel to the Communist Party that would later spawn the revolution in Russia. So Zionists and communists were ideological foes. And for that reason, once the Bolsheviks came to power, they gradually but consistently tried to strangle the political activity of the Zionist movement in the Soviet Union. So in 1948, when the Soviet Union decided to support, well, even earlier than that, in 1947, when the Soviet Union decided to support the creation of Israel, basically to support the two-state solution at the United Nations, when the Soviet representative, Andrei Gromyko, stood up and spoke about the catastrophe that happened to the Jewish people, i.e. the Holocaust, and about the Jewish people's right to have a national home of its own in Palestine. That was a big surprise, okay? People didn't expect this ideological U-turn from the Soviet Union, especially since its declared ideology was to oppose national movements and speak about the solidarity of the working class the world over. We don't know for certain why Stalin decided to support the establishment of Israel. Various reasons, but at this point, he was obviously interested to push the British Empire out of the Middle East. So that must have been reason number one. Another thing is that he knew that there were plans to create a pipeline between Saudi Arabia and the refineries at the Haifa Gulf. And that was a great way to subvert American plans to do that. Other than that, I think that Stalin realized at that stage that he couldn't work with any of the royal Arab regimes in the Middle East. They were conservative and pro-Western. So I think it was pretty clear to Stalin that once there would be a Jewish state in the middle of the Arab world, there would be a war, and that war would rock the social order in the Middle East in a way that might be beneficial to the Soviet Union. So the years 1948 until 1953 were the high point of Israeli-Soviet relations. It's not just that Moscow allowed about 300,000 Jews to immigrate to Israel, and during the war of 1948, that was great help because that was manpower that Israel could recruit and use in the battlefields. Israel also purchased 22 weapons to the tune of $22 million from Czechoslovakia, but that wouldn't have happened without Soviet approval. And it's not only that, but Stalin also gave an order to Czechoslovakia to sell weapons only to Israel and not sell weapons to Egypt, although Egypt had an open order and signed a contract with Czechoslovakia. So Soviet help was crucial. That's what Ben-Gurion later wrote in his diary. He wrote that maybe without Soviet support, we wouldn't have won the 1948 war. After that, we have the war in Korea, 1950. So that brings a little bit of echo because that was a local war, but with global significance. It's one of the main events of the Cold War. And that was the point in time where the United States asked Israel to take a stand and declare clearly where, like, its position with regard to the Korean War. And once Israel did something very similar to what it is doing now, it sent medical help to Korea. Then Israeli-Soviet relations went south. They became much, much worse after it became clear that Israel supports the American position in the Korean conflict. In 1953, diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and Israel were severed after a bomb was thrown into the Soviet embassy in Tel Aviv. But what is interesting to note, though, is that throughout that period, the Soviet Union was a major supplier of oil to Israel. That was also very important. I mean, it was beneficial economically. Israel needed the oil, and the Soviet Union wanted to sell it. But even though diplomatic relations were severed, economic relations continued up until the Suez Crisis in 1956. That was the point in which the Soviet Union decided to stop supplying oil to Israel in retaliation for the Israeli participation in Operation Musketeer, the French, British, Israeli operation against the Nasser regime in Egypt. And, you know, from that point onwards, things became even worse until we get to 1970, where the two countries actually fought a direct war above the sky of the Suez Canal and above, the western bank of the Suez Canal. In 1970, the Soviets sent expeditionary force into Egypt, 10,000 people strong, and they basically took responsibility to defend Egypt's skies. So Israel bombed Soviet air defense units, and in July 1970, there was a direct dogfight between Israeli pilots in Phantom planes and Soviet pilots in MiG aircraft. And the Israelis won that specific dogfight, but they kind of lost that war because of the Soviet intervention. So up to the end of the Cold War, relations continued to be rather tense until we get to Gorbachev. Gorbachev opened the gates for Jewish immigrations. There was the first ministerial visit. I'm sure you didn't know that, Galia. The first people to visit the Kremlin after Gorbachev's rise to power were Yuval Ne'eman as Minister of Science and Yitzhak Modai as Minister of Finance. And it was also about greed, because Gorbachev thought that those two people can arrange a big loan to the Soviet Union, because at the time, the Soviet Union was in big financial trouble. Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, relations were normalized, and that brings us basically to the present.
Okay, thank you for this tour de force of all the history from 1948 until almost now. But it's interesting that throughout this period, we had strategic considerations and economic considerations guiding these relations. And in the background, there were also ideological issues, which you sort of mentioned very, in the background. But if we zoom forward to the experience, to the situation we're in now, a lot actually has changed since the end of the Cold War, and especially, for us international relations scholars, talking about the end of what we call the bipolar system. That was very clear. In many ways, I would say the period now is somewhat similar to the period when Israel was formed. It was different in many ways, but in terms of the system that is not sending extremely clear signals. And the story that Guy is telling us is how as the Cold War emerged and became stabilized, so were the choices for Israel in terms of the camps it was supporting. Then the Cold War ends, the Soviet Union collapses, and the system in general becomes a bit more complicated. We are talking about first at the age of American hegemony, American unipolarity. These are the terms we use. But since probably the early 2000s, many people are beginning to wonder whether this is changing and we're moving towards a system that's more complicated, more complex, a multipolar system. We see the rise of China, and we see a resurgent Russia that is becoming at least more active and more ambitious to return its former status, at least under Putin. So if we get to the situation we're in now, given that we don't have that much time, let's divide this to. Can you explain to us first what are the current interests that Israel has in its relations with? Let's start with Russia, okay, and then we could compare this to the interest with the U.S., and then we can see that we have a dilemma.
So, well, Putin comes to power in 2000, right? And I think, like, the main interest that Israel has vis-a-vis Putin is to convince him not to sell weapons to Arab countries, because Putin is about several things, but one of the main ones is oil. Okay, one of the things that people don't know about him, that he wrote an MA thesis about this particular question. And in that MA thesis, he described Russia's economic strategy and that it should focus on exporting raw materials, particularly oil and gas. So if you want to export oil and gas, you better have good relations with Arab countries that produce oil and gas. You want to coordinate prices in the energy market with them. So one thing that Israel was concerned about was that Putin would decide to sell a specific air defense system to Syria, and that's the S-300 or the S-400. So lots of the meetings between Israeli leaders and Putin revolve around that question. Then we have the Arab Spring and the civil war in Syria, right? That's 2011. So from that point onward, what Israel is concerned about is Russian attempts to support the disintegrating Assad dictatorship in Syria. At some point, Putin decides to militarily intervene in Syria. And from that point onwards, both Israel and Syria have an interest in not colliding militarily in Syria.
Russia. Israel and Russia.
Yeah. So, I mean, what Putin wants is to have Assad remain in power. And Israel, I think, was agnostic about who would win the Syrian civil war. Like, we thought all of the local or Syrian actors involved were equally bad. So, but what Israel definitely didn't want is to see Iran ensconcing itself, establishing itself in Syria. And from Putin's point of view, he wanted to use the Iranians as foot soldiers to help him, resurrect the Assad regime in Syria. But after that, he's not that interested in, keeping the Iranians around. If Israel can push Iran out of Syria, that's fine, as long as Israeli military operations, especially bombing, basically, do not hurt, do not injure Russian forces, that's okay. So what Israel and Putin's Russia is working on in Syria is deconflicting, making sure that there would be no military clash between Russian military operations in Syria and Israeli air operations in Syria. And in fact, we know that both armies have a red line, so they can connect in real time if there's an issue. And every few months, an Israeli prime minister was Netanyahu, or now Bennett, goes to Moscow basically to, unfurl a map of Syria and say, this is where we are, this is where you are. We want to avoid confrontation, and let's talk about how we do that. So that's Israel's main strategic issue with Russia itself, okay? So not, bringing relations into a crisis in order not to find itself in the same situation where Israel was in 1970, fighting directly with Russian forces, as I just described. But I think it's not only about Russia. It's not only about Syria. There's also, Israel have relations with countries that trade with Russia, like China and India. So, the Russian dilemma for Israel is bigger and more complex than Syria per se, in my view.
Okay. Okay, let's switch to the American side. We still need the Americans, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. What would you say are, if you just had to let the basic ongoing Israeli interests since the Cold War in in maintaining solid strategic relations with the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that Israel is a loyal ally and a strategic ally in the Middle East, like a solid American ally in the Middle East. The two countries have extensive security, education, economic relations. But if we're speaking like specifically what happens since the Russian invasion into Ukraine and that implication on Israeli-American relations, which I think, right, you were kind of pointing in that direction. Well, I think the Biden administration would have been much happier if Israel would have more enthusiastically supported American diplomacy and NATO actions with regard to that confrontation. I think there's some understanding why Israel supports the Western position on the Ukraine conflict. It also supported the Western position in the UN and condemned the Russian invasion to Ukraine. But I don't think that for the Biden administration, like the most urgent thing right now is to see Israel vocally supporting Ukraine. The fact that Israel right now is deepening its relations with Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates, I think Washington looks at that very positively, because like if you're sitting in Washington right now, you have a lot on your plate in terms of foreign policy. There is the confrontation in Europe, there's the pivot to Asia, and also the Saudis and other Gulf countries have their own conflicts with Iran, their involvement in the Yemen war, their confrontation with the Houthis in Yemen. So if Israel could play a role, it could not replace the American role in the Persian Gulf in terms of securing maritime navigation and the oil trade in the Gulf. But it can somewhat ally Saudi and United Arab Emirates' fears about being abandoned, right? And we're seeing it right now. We're seeing the Israeli foreign minister going to the Gulf, the Israeli defense minister going to the Gulf. We just saw a summit in Egypt between the Israeli prime minister, the Egyptian president, and the ruler of the United Arab Emirates. So Israel is playing a very positive role, I think, from the American point of view, in the sense that it gives its backing. Well, I think maybe a security umbrella would be a stretch, but it can play a positive role in securing the security interests of Gulf states other than Iran. So I think that's a bigger plus, a bigger advantage from an American point of view than what Israel would say or not say about the conflict in Ukraine, in which it cannot play a major role in any way.
Sure. Thank you. So I hear you, Guy, and I what I understand from this is that the higher stakes that Israel has is with Russia because we have immediate security interests involved in case we actually, the relations deteriorate. How much, we talked about the need to coordinate in Syria to avoid a military clash. And Israel, there is this mutual interest at this point, right, of Israel not wanting Iranian forces to get a stronghold in Syria, and the Russians at this point also not interested in a stronger Iran in Syria. So I wonder how much leeway in your assessment Israel has vis-a-vis the Russians, because it's not only about the Russians allowing Israel to do something for Israel, because it's also serving Russian interests. So I wonder, this is just your assessment, how much can Israel push Russia in terms of, taking a clearer stance vis-a-vis the conflict without actually risking some sort of Russian retaliation on the Syrian front? Because retaliating on the Syrian front, not coordinating policy with Israel would actually be bad for the Russians as well.
Right. I think, first thing is, neither Israel nor Russia would be interested in starting a confrontation right now over Syria. Neither Israel nor Russia would be interested in that. Like, the last thing that Putin needs is also to have a conflagration in the Middle East over his intervention in Syria. As it is, he's barely standing by. I think the bigger issue is what Israel is doing in the Gulf right now. I mean, for the sanctions to work, for the sanctions on Russia to work and injure Putin badly, okay, Washington needs cooperation from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia currently feels neglected. It's highly concerned about the possibility of Iran reaching a settlement over the nuclear issue, both with Washington and with the EU. So Israel can play a role in fulfilling some of the security needs of Saudi Arabia and its neighbors, and convincing them to play along with the American scheme. And in order for the American scheme to work at some point, both the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia need to pump more oil into the energy market, thereby hurting Russia and weakening its leverage over Western customers in Europe. I think that's the main play.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So we actually have some dilemmas. At the same time, as you said, we really can't influence the world that much, as much as we think we are very important. So in a way, you could say we have the luxury of staying less decided because we are not crucial for the war itself. But maybe we should have put this on the table to begin with. I would want just to state, what Israel actually has done and hasn't done in terms of taking a stand and doing something about the war in the Ukraine. So Guy has already mentioned the fact that Israel did vote clearly to support the UN resolution that condemned the Russian invasion. So diplomatically, that's probably the clearest thing that we did say. Practically, Israel actually has done quite a bit. We've sent probably tons of medical equipment to the Ukraine. I think we are the only state that actually built a field hospital that just started operating in Ukraine itself, not in Poland. And that is operating with Israeli physicians. Israel has been accepting refugees, and here there's this distinction between the major efforts to actually bring out Ukrainian Jews as part of the law, those eligible through the law of return to actually make aliyah. And here there's at least from where we stand, there are like really impressive stories of how the Ministry of the Foreign Ministry, excuse me, actually has sent people abroad, and they're working in really difficult situations to get Jews out of the Ukraine. So here the assessment is that there would be up to 100,000 Ukrainians actually coming to Israel. But then there was the other story of accepting refugees who are not Jewish. And I think this is where a lot of the criticism sort of was pointed at, because of the initial quota of up to 2,000 refugees coming in. And this has been, there's been an internal debate about this, and we can talk about this a bit later. Then, of course, there's a story of our prime minister serving as a mediator, going to Russia, surprising many people here as well. And this has been also a rather sort of complex, I think, story that some people see as very positive, and some people are viewing as either risky or naive or extremely problematic, because this is, in a way, it seems like it's serving Russian, it's serving Putin, and that is another big thing. We can look historically, whether mediators actually benefit from trying to mediate in situations like this. I'm not really sure about that.
I think, well, Naftali Bennett, the prime minister. So on the one hand, it's surprising that he emerged as a mediator, a surprising mediator in this conflict, and it seems that both the Ukrainian president and Zelensky and Putin are declaring publicly that they use the services of the Israeli government. But on the other hand, I don't think that Bennett can be anything more than a mailman, basically passing messages from Putin to Zelensky. So a mailman more than a mediator, because at the end of the day, if there'll be any kind of settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, Israel is much it's too small in terms of its imprint in either Ukraine or Russia to play that role. Like, if and when Russia and Ukraine would discuss seriously a settlement between them, then only the big guys would sit at the table, and that would be the United States and the European Union. I think these are the only actors that matters in a case like that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, although one of our, Elena from the audience has noted that perceptions and optics are important, and the visit of Prime Minister Bennett to Russia accomplished important perceptive roles. That may be the case, but that's also debated even in Israel itself. I guess we will wait and see if we have a summit in Jerusalem or not.
That would be something, won't it?
Yes. But even then, so I said what Israel has done, but just to point, the flip side is what Israel is not willing to do as of yet. Israel is not willing to send military aid to the Ukraine. We've heard President Zelensky give his very angry speech to the Israeli Knesset a few days ago. They would really want to have something like our Iron Dome, which would be extremely helpful for them. And I guess the other big thing which I've seen in the questions as well is the issue of sanctions. Israel has not joined the direct sanctions against Russia. It's complicated for Israel in many ways, and maybe I can say a bit about that. Israel has, though, tried to maneuver between this, not to actually endorse the sanctions, but at the same time, Foreign Minister Lapid has said very clearly that Israel is doing its best not to become a tool to actually circumvent the international sanctions. So, for example, they just announced a few days ago that Russian oligarchs could not park their private jets in Israeli airports for more than 48 hours. So they can come here, but they can't actually move like their planes and their yachts to Israel. And this is, of course, something that's going to be very complicated to follow through. And I am curious to see how long we can actually stand in face of pressures to actually join the direct sanctions. One point that may be worth mentioning there is that, even if the state of Israel is not officially applying sanctions, Israeli companies that are actually operating at the global level will probably have to comply with EU or US sanctions if they want to continue to play the global role. That may be more important than what the Israeli government does. Guy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, one last thing about the Bennett's role as a mediator. I think one of the interests of Putin of assigning Bennett that role is by giving him the role of mediator. That buys time for Bennett to not take a position, right? So if there's international pressure to say, like, Israel, you should step up to the plate and do your part. So Bennett can say, yeah, I don't want to take a too overt position because that would hurt my role as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine. So that's one thing. The other thing, Israel's economic relations with Russia itself is not particularly important for the Israel economy, but then Israel has a lot of important relations with Russia's neighbors, right? So the big secret, but it's no longer a secret. So I can say, Israel buys oil from Azerbaijan, right? If Putin wants to interfere in that trade, which is important to Israel, he can easily do so, okay? Then there's significant military sales in Asia. Putin can interfere in that as well. Okay, confrontation with Russia. What would it do to Israeli-Chinese economic relations? Because China is kind of an ally with Russia. So the issue of economics is not so much about Israel's relations with Russia, but rather Israeli economic relations with Russia's neighbors. So obviously, like, if Biden would have wanted Israel to take a clear stand on the sanctions issue, well, that would have happened tomorrow or even today if, Biden pushed really hard. But since he isn't doing that for reasons I mentioned, I think for Biden, it's much more important what Israel is doing in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, rather than what it would do vis-a-vis the Ukraine conflict. So since Washington isn't pushing Israel hard on this point, Israel would deliberate and equivocate as long as it can. Because if there's something we know from history, that politicians don't take hard decisions until they must.
Which may be the wise thing to do.
Then you have the most information available.
Yes.
Right?
Indeed. And that, I guess, leads me to the last point I wanted to sort of open up. And that's the ongoing, I guess it's still like a secondary discussion about the normative dimension of Israeli policy. And we've seen in Israel, both, I guess, within Israeli society and also among politicians, this discussion about whether Israel should be making a much clearer stance, just in terms, not in strategic, but in normative terms, because there's clearly you know, the bad and the good in this story, at least in the big picture. And we've heard this from various people, just in terms of the general Israeli. Okay, I guess there are two issues here. One is just our moral responsibility in general as a state, as, you know, democratic state, part of the international society of civilized states, to actually clearly, in a clear voice, condemn this Russian invasion and do anything we can to actually help the Ukrainians. And that's the same, I think, claim you can make for other states as well. That's how I started this conversation, by stating that even though clearly the Europeans are sending also military aid to the Ukraine, opening their borders for refugees, and offering strong, you know, rhetorical support, no one is actually willing to send forces into the Ukraine to actually fend the Russians off. So the dilemma is there, I think, for everyone. In the case of Israel, the second argument that is raised here is that Israel actually had a special moral responsibility, given the unique nature of our state, our history, the Holocaust, our history as a state that, you know, of refugees, and that we have to go this extra mile to be sensitive to these issues. I think it's an important discussion, but I think, as Guy, I think very nicely described before, Israel is trying to maneuver here between several considerations that make it really hard, I think, to speak in a very clear moral voice. And that may be, you know, the challenge of doing foreign policy in general, that it's easier to sound these very clear moral voices from outside the government than if you're in that position. I should say also that a lot of this discussion is not, I think, as forceful when we talk about military aid to the Ukraine. It's clear why this is problematic. At least in Israel, it's a much more passionate discussion when we're talking about letting in non-Jewish Ukrainian refugees, even for a temporary time, to Israel. This is where we've seen very strong emotional responses in Israel, from, you know, elderly Holocaust survivors all the way to, you know, to younger people, because there's, I think, a strong sense that something is really wrong with this very restrictive policy that is being applied by our government, Interior Ministry. This as well, I will end with that. This is also not a new problem, because we've been having these internal debates about accepting asylum seekers and refugees from Sudan, from other, you know, from coming in through Egypt, from Africa. And there has been an ongoing discussion about how strict the Israeli government is in terms of letting in non-Jewish asylum seekers, despite international legislation and things like that. So it's an ongoing debate that we have in Israel, but I think it's much. This is a very passionate discussion in Israel at this point. Okay, we have Amara. We have like 9 minutes, right? So maybe we should go through. We don't have that many questions, so we can actually go through all of them and see if we have anything intelligent to say about them. Okay.
Sure.
And if anyone else wants to add questions, you know.
And Galia, you can look also in the question and answer box. There are questions, even if I think you touched the points that were asked.
So, it's a different one. Okay. I was looking at the chat. Okay.
Yeah, there are some ones you touched some point, but if you want to read those questions too.
Okay. Okay, let's see what we have here. Okay. what about Russian money pouring into Israeli high tech? And that's also the Jewish oligarchs are, part of this. How much money is actually going into Israeli high tech companies from Russia?
Well, we can't know, but I don't think it's a major consideration for the Israeli government. American investments in Israeli high-tech companies are much more important, and also the technological ties that run through various levels and different sectors, both civilian and military, far outweigh any role that Russian Jewish money plays in Israel's high-tech industry. So I don't think that's the reason for Israel's cautious stand with regard to the Ukrainian conflict.
Okay. Following the things you said before, someone did ask, Elena asked if this should be the moment when Saudi Arabia finally joins the Abraham Accords and the alliance, and make it clear this is really a defensive alliance vis-a-vis Iran.
The Saudi alliance to declare the Saudi alliance with Israel. I think, well, we've come a long way in terms of this very, it's an open secret by now that Israel has relations, contact, communication directly with the Saudi government. Okay, it exists without an overt declaration, but I think in the last few years, the Saudis have signaled in every way possible that they think about Israel as an ally. Whether it would be publicly declared or not, I can't say. It's a very reasonable hypothesis that it will happen in the next few months and years. Saudi Arabia and Israel have joint interests, and by all means, we can think of that alliance deepening in the following years, along the lines, by the way, that Israel had an alliance with the Shah's Iran, that is basically energy in exchange for technology.
Okay, thank you. There was another interesting question about relations between Israel and Turkey, especially in relationship to a future selling of gas to Europe, and how will Russia see this possible move?
I don't think Russia is intimidated by Israeli liquefied natural gas sales to Europe. The acronym is LNG. No, what Israel can supply doesn't even tickle Russian abilities in terms of export and in terms of the quantities that the European energy market needs to get by. Turkey is a very important country in what will happen in terms of energy supply to Europe. Turkey, because of its locations, hold the keys to Europe. It's at the gates of Europe in terms of getting big quantities of gas, say from Qatar, to Southern Europe, and from there to the rest of the European Union. So I think, and we already seen that Israel and Turkey have an interest in improving their relations because they can cooperate in being transit territory to supply Persian Gulf gas to Europe. I think that would be the key for Israeli-Turkish cooperation in the near future.
I should add that I think this question is timely because we've also seen a very dramatic visit of our President Herzog to Ankara, which seems to bode a new beginning of normalization of relations between Israel and Turkey, and that has to do more with Turkish, I think, economic needs at this point. And we actually hosted at the Leonard Davis Institute last week a first meeting after a very long time with a group of Turkish scholars, and they were extremely skeptical at the end about the likelihood of like a real gas deal between a gas pipe between Israel and Turkey, given the fact that to actually build cooperation on energy requires such at least a basic level, but solid level of bilateral trust. It's a long-term project, and they were very skeptical that this is actually likely to happen. But we do see this change in Turkish-Israeli relations, which is related to other things, but I think the war was going to make it even more important for Turkey to actually rebuild this relationship. So that is a good question. Someone asked about, what happens if Putin is actually leaves office one way or another, if the war actually goes very, very badly for Russia, and does Israel have any relations with the Russian opposition so as, we can cooperate with them later? I still think this is wishful thinking. There is the opposition in Russia today is in prison.
It's in prison, and the social forces that can support this opposition are fleeing Russia. Like, you would think that if there would be a major political change, it will come from above, from like someone within the Russian elite would decide to remove Putin or put him aside. But it's, who knows? Who knows? I'm not sure even, Biden knows the answer to that question. It's a big mystery.
Yes. Okay, I'm looking quickly at other questions. I think we addressed some of them before when we talked about, questions about the moral issue arising from not directly calling out Russia. It is an issue, and I think all major powers are implicated one way or another with this. And it's something, that I think it's important to think about this and discuss and not brush it off. Are there sections in Israeli society that are particularly pro-Russian? That is a good question. Actually, I hear much more pro-Ukrainian voices everywhere, people putting their flags on, the Ukrainian flags. But I actually do not know people who immigrated from Russia, if there's support for Russia here. There's actually...
Well, I think there's some sympathy in the Israeli right towards Putin. I wasn't following that discussion very closely, but I'd say that the voices that support Israel right now in the Israeli public sphere are pretty muted. I mean, largely the conversation is pro-Ukrainian, very sympathetic towards Ukraine.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we'll end with just the strong comment by Akiva. I don't know if everyone can see the Q&A as well about Israel, between right and wrong. And Akiva suggests that when Israel finds itself any place but on the side of right, it stands to lose its status as a respected moral voice. And as I said before, I think that's, that's something we need to consider. I think, and this is just my own opinion, that there's a gap here between the Israeli people that are clearly there. They make a very strong moral statement here. They're opening their pockets and their hearts to the Ukrainian people. and the Israeli government that I think still tries to speak in a moral voice, but is very much constrained by the realpolitik considerations it needs to consider. I would say that perhaps another final argument we can make in this regard is that maybe being on the right side of history is also strategically important, because and that addresses one of the questions about the EU-US sanctions, whether in the long run, we'll really be punished for not joining them. To the extent that this clear moral voice is actually something that sticks, and that Europeans and Americans actually pursue this to the end. If Israel is portrayed as being on the wrong side of history, then that would have also not just normative, but also political implications for the future of our relations with, at least with the Europeans. But I think Israel is trying to do a lot on the civilian side to actually support the Ukrainian people. And I think we shouldn't belittle whatever Israel is doing. But I think this debate will remain open, and probably that is a good thing, because it's something we need to keep in mind. So I think we don't have time for more questions, and I think we covered a lot of ground here. So I thank you all for joining, and continue following and arguing about this, and letting us know what you think. And I hope we can meet again. Mara, you do the closing words?
Yeah, and thank you a lot to you, Guy and Galia, for this very interesting section. We all hope that this war will end in a way or the other as soon as possible, and we will speak about the as history and not as politics, actual politics now. Thank you to everybody for joining us. I will send the recording in a few days to all of you, and thank you to you all again. Later out.
Later out.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.